Welcome and thank you for standing by. At this time, all participants are in a listen-only mode. During the question and answer session, please press star one on your touch-tone phone. Today's conference is being recorded. If you have any objections, you may disconnect at this time. And now, I'd like to turn the meeting over to Ms. Rosa Pace. Thank you.
Thank you, Mary. Good afternoon. Thank you, all of you who dialed in today for today's webinar. For those on the East Coast, and good morning for those of you joining us on the West Coast. I'd like to thank everybody for being with us today to get a better understanding of certificates of free sale. I'm Rosa Pace, Senior International Trade Specialist for the Global Knowledge Center at the U.S. Department of Commerce. This webinar will be presented by Suzanne Richer, who is the President of Customs and Trade Solutions, Inc. Upon the completion of the presentation, Suzanne will be available to answer your questions. Now, for those of you who just joined, you can still log into the webinar by entering the URL address and the passcode per instructions that were sent to you via email. And just to make sure that everyone fully benefits from this webinar, you're able to hear this presentation via your phone and simultaneously via your computer. So if you're not hooked up to both, please take a moment to do so. Also remember that if you have any technical difficulties, at any time you can contact your operator, as she indicated. If you wish, you may download today's presentation directly on your desktop by clicking on the logo on your screen, marked with three pages symbol. This is up in your upper right corner. We also will be sending you a copy of the presentation upon the completion of this webinar. Please note that during this webinar, you'll be able to type your questions, not on the top of your page, an icon with letters Q&A. When you click on this icon, you'll be able to type in questions at any time during this presentation. Typed questions that we will not be able to answer during the webinar will be responded via email after the presentation itself. Also, at the end of the presentation, we will open the lines for live questions. Now, it is my great pleasure to introduce to you our webinar speaker, Suzanne Richer. She's a seasoned speaker with extensive experience assisting U.S. exporters. She's a founder and president of Customs and Trade Solutions, Inc. The website is www.ctsadvisors.com. Suzanne is also a licensed customs broker. She has over 26 years experience in international supply chain management. She has worked with ports of Detroit, Miami, Newark, and Philadelphia. Ms. Richer has counseled corporations involved in the importation of food, automotive vehicles and parts, electronics, wearing apparel and machinery, and the likes. She has worked with clients during their closing audits with U.S. Customs, assisted companies with TPAT, cargo security program validation, and Tier 3 levels, both domestically and around the world, including locations in China, Japan, Germany, Indonesia, and South Korea. Later this month, she'll be in Vietnam for the TPAT validation. She has also counseled corporations on international trade law issues. Not only does Ms. Richer serve as a consultant, she's the author of numerous articles and books, including a featured profile in a recently published $1 Million Conversations published by Insight Publishing. In 2006, she was recognized by the Journal of Commerce as one of the top 20 women in transportation. Suzanne has also served as a contributing editor at Logistics Management magazine. She's also a well-thought speaker and presenter. She's knowledgeable in many different aspects of trade, including free trade agreements. And it is my great pleasure to welcome Suzanne Richer. Suzanne, the floor is yours.
Great. Thank you so much. Well, good afternoon, everyone, and welcome. Our topic today is export compliance and the certificate of free sale and what that means to a corporation, how to secure one, and some of the technical information that you might need to draw together in order to successfully secure one prior to exportation. And as Rosa mentioned, we'd be happy to answer any questions, and if we run out of time at the end, then certainly you can send them via email to either the Department of Commerce, who will forward them, and or our address, which is listed at the end. So it's great to have everyone here, and I'm operating with some assistance here because my computer PowerPoint section is not live on my computer. So I'll just ask Rosa to go ahead, and we're going to talk a little bit about export responsibility in the very beginning, just to remind you of the requirements of a company when they export. And of course, the role of the exporter identifies you really as the principal party in interest in the export transaction. So whether or not you're the U.S. manufacturer or the seller, or partially you could also be the ordering party, you're responsible for all of the export compliance requirements of this particular transaction. And it's important to note that because as we talk about documentation and the requirements for exports, if something is missing at the time of the transaction, it will result in a hold generally in the receiving country, which of course can lead to delays, the confiscation of cargo, and even potentially the loss of the shipment or penalties or storage fees, et cetera. So we want to make sure that we are clear on those roles. And the role of the freight forwarder, of course, is to move the product from point A to point B. And so while they assist you in your documentation, and they're usually very thorough in helping you through these transactions, if something goes astray, they technically are not liable for the loss of documentation. So we're going to help explain to you how to control this with your receiving party, with the buyer that you're looking at. And the role of the government, just as a reminder, when we look at these different agencies and all the different restrictions on certificates of sale, we still have the requirements of the Commerce Department, State Department, and Treasury Department. So if there are other concerns, such as export licensing requirements, which of course may be driven by the type of product you're exporting or the destination to which you're exporting, you need to ensure that you've also met those requirements as well. The key government agency overseeing export transactions is the Bureau of Industry and Security. They oversee and also update export administration regulations. So all the requirements for compliance in terms of record keeping, for example, are outlined under the BIS. And as a reminder, all documents, import or export related, must be held for a minimum of 5 years from the date of export. And for those of you who also import, under customs regulations, it will be 5 years from the date of import. So when we talk about an export and we define it, it's confirmed as something that is carried away or sent out of the country, which probably seems pretty logical, or leaving the country, or it's being exported. But I'm noting this now because one of the key responsibilities of the company is to ensure that a bill of lading has been cut and it's demonstrated that this product actually leaves the country. There is a portion of product destined for exports that is sometimes confiscated or stolen en route to the border and actually doesn't physically leave the country. And it often enters the gray market, where we actually have products that are real products, correct parts, and of course they may be stolen and sold on eBay or other areas. So it's always important to make sure that you have a copy of your bill of lading and proof of the actual physical export of the product. You could also be subject to any regulations or restrictions on products that are re-exported. So when you've exported it to one country in person and they decide to re-export it to another group, we are responsible for that transaction through to end user. So as we discuss the certificate of free sale and some of the information required, it's important to again remember that we have some level of responsibility through to the final end user who receives our product in the form in which we exported it. And as we look at our export responsibility, and we talk about documentation, export controls, and any other area of compliance specific to the product that you're exporting, remember that no one can participate in an export with any knowledge that a violation has occurred or is even about to occur. And when Customs and the Bureau of Industry and Security work together, they will track banned exports or irregular exports to their source, and along the way, they can actually cite the exporter or the freight forwarder or even the manufacturer for penalty action. So the entire transaction is best handled when it's thoroughly documented and can be demonstrated that a true export has occurred and we're in compliance with all these different agencies and their groups. So when we look at an export request for quote, depending on how you structure the sale, you'll have certain responsibilities that will differ between you, the exporter, and your end buyer or the importer. And there are really two main concerns. We have to legally export it from the United States. And the way that we handle the transaction and the documentation that we create must also help the buyer legally enter that product into the receiving country. So we're looking for export requirements and we're looking for import requirements. So at the time of the sale, it's always good to refer to the Incoterm that you're using. Many of you, I'm sure, are familiar with this, and there have been separate webinars on this topic. But the only Incoterm that requires the buyer to clear the product for export in the United States is ExWorks. So for those of you who have concerns with some of these documents that we're discussing today or are working with companies who prefer to control it, if you're selling something ExWorks, then the buyer or the importer of record in the receiving country is required to clear it for export out of the United States and then handle the transaction and transportation into their country, and then, of course, complete the transaction by clearing it through customs into the receiving country. In all other situations, when we sell on FOB terms or CIF, CIP, or any of the D terms, what we call delivery terms, then you, the exporter of record, become responsible for the export clearance. And that means that part of your agreement in this transaction is to ensure that you understand and know the documentation required, again, to legally export it from the United States and to assist in the process of legally importing it into the receiving country by working directly with your customer. So in many cases, when the original quote goes out, it's a positive practice to ask your customer, the importer of record in the receiving country, what documentation they require as part of the transaction. They may require more documents or ask for things other than the basic documents that you're continuing, that you prepare on a regular basis. And the reason I'm mentioning this up front is because when we import something into the United States, we can give suppliers clear and specific directions on what we need to clear customs into the United States. But when we export something, we have to make sure that we have taken into account the receiving country's requirements. So the documentation, for example, that we prepare for China will be different from documentation that we prepare for Mexico or Venezuela or any other country around the world. So it's important to know the differences country to country on what documents are required and then how to properly secure them and prepare them prior to the actual shipment. So when we look at the export shipment process and the preparation of documents, the minimum documents that your company in the United States will prepare is a copy, of course, the commercial invoice, a packing list, and ideally the packing list is broken down into very specific information, not just a repeat of information on the commercial invoice, but an actual breakdown box by box on what's contained or what's in each box. the bill of lading, as we mentioned earlier, and then depending on the value, if it's over $2,500, you're responsible for filing your exporter's electronic information, also formerly known as the Shipper's Export Act, or SED. And then beyond those documents, any additional documents that are country-specific, such as a free trade agreement certificate, or if it's not eligible for a free trade agreement, you may be requested to complete a certificate of origin. And of course, we're going to talk a little bit now about the certificate of sale and what those requirements are in this particular process. So the import country requirements should be determined at the time of the quote, ideally, and prior to actually processing the shipment in order to alleviate issues along the way. Now, one of the key elements of any export transaction is the classification code. As many of you know, we use something called the Harmonized Tariff Schedule, and we determine what the classification code is for our particular product. The HTS code is accepted by 170 different countries, and we're harmonized for that particular number. That code is important to us because, first off, it determines whether or not that product is admissible into the receiving country. It also indicates if there's any special requirements. So, for example, if I properly classify a food product, it may immediately, in the receiving country, indicate that I need a certificate of sale as part of the documentation required to clear customs. If for some reason we misclassify the product and it would have required a certificate of sale or some other pertinent document, then the receiving government can often take the position that the product was misclassified simply to avoid some of the proper documentation. So it's important that you've taken the time in advance to properly classify your product and determine any special requirements in advance of shipping. And as a reminder, the breakdown of the classification code looks like this, where we have 2 digits to a chapter, 4 to a heading, and 6 to a subheading. And you'll notice that we starred the 6-digit code because we're harmonized around the world only to 6 digits. After the 6th digit, many countries will add as many numbers as they want in the receiving country. So we in the United States, for example, added an additional 4 digits. We have a 10-digit import code. But when we export something, we will drop those last 4 digits and provide only the 6-digit code to the receiving country. This is important so that we can confirm that we are all using the same code to the level to which it's harmonized, and to lower the amount of discussion that might happen between yourself and the buyer on whether or not you have the correct code. And as we previously mentioned, that code drives whether or not there are additional requirements, including that certificate of free sale. So correct coding is important, and part of the information you'll be sharing at the time of export. So let's talk for a few minutes about the FDA export certificates in general. Of course, we know that the Food and Drug Administration, the FDA, is responsible for, really today, a global environment. And food safety is really more important now than ever. The supply chains that move pharmaceutical products, animals, food, all these different supply chains are complex, and they have very challenging responsibilities. And so as a result, many of the world's largest companies, retailers, and even manufacturers have begun to set higher food safety standards and many of them are choosing to mandate supplier compliance with one of several different global standards. So part of that process in working with the FDA is to review the actual item for export and determine if it's required to have an FDA export certificate as part of the process to allow it to be registered or imported into another country. So what type of certificates does the FDA actually issue? Well, they have a number of different certificates, including what we call a certificate to a foreign government, which could be for the export of products that can be legally marketed in the United States, certificates of exportability, non-clinical research use only. These are certificates for the export of products, materials, or components for non-clinical research use only that is not intended for human use. And again, these are items that could be marketed in and legally exported from the United States. We have a certificate of free sale, health certificates, and various specified risk materials. So it's important that you know which certificate is required of your particular product before you begin confirming what type of documentation you're going to secure and how long that's actually going to take. Because the time frame for securing these different certificates can add weeks to the process, and you have to allocate enough time in advance of the shipment to actually secure this documentation. So when we talk about certificates of free sale, what are they and how do they work? Basically, certificates of free sale are certificates that indicate that the particular product that is being exported is actually marketed in the United States or eligible for export, and that the particular manufacturer has no unresolved enforcement actions pending before or taken by the FDA. These certificates may be issued by the FDA or any other authorized agency, and again, should be confirmed prior to exportation. Now, these certificates may be specific to a product line, but a certificate will not pertain to a particular production lot or a particular export consignment. Now, if you're wondering which countries require which export certificates, it's really best to go to the FDA website, or you can go to the USDA Food Export Certificate database, and you can look up each country, and you can look up the different products that are regulated through this process. Now, if I look at a certificate of free sale, many countries are now requiring these certificates. They are also, of course, again, called certificates of export, and some countries will call them a certificate to the foreign government. So it probably translates back to certificate of free sale. But you want to make sure, again, at the time of quoting, when the importer of record or the buyer requests a particular document, that you are both in agreement as to which certificate they're actually looking for. And looking at that slide, certificate of free sale, the good news is that the FDA has created an electronic filing capability. So these documents can be secured in both a hard copy and they can be secured electronically today. So the U.S. Food and Drug Administration has unveiled an automated system that allows companies who are exporting food, for example, from the United States, to file electronically for certificates of free sale. These certificates are often requested by international customers or even other governments to verify that the product leaving the country can be legally sold in the United States. Now again, the reason the receiving country is looking for this is they're looking to make sure that this product complies with the requirements of U.S. laws for distribution in the American market, in the American domestic market. So if they're not legal here, then it may cause issues, obviously, with distribution of this product into other markets. And obviously, if your product qualifies, this can be a competitive advantage over other companies who can't provide this particular document. So to handle this process electronically, you need to go to the Customs FDA Electronic Unified Registration and Listing System, also known as FURLS, up on the slide, and go through the certification application process. And you should be able to find this online rather simply, but if you have an issue, we can always send you the link. But I'll just walk you through some of the requirements it takes to actually establish an account and some of the benefits that you have from using an electronic system versus applying for this in a hard copy format and sending that forward. So when you enter the actual system, you're going to look for a certificate application process, and that will initiate an automatic slide for you. You enter your new application information, and the system is really rather simple to use, and it allows you to go in and select the type of certificate that you would like to apply for. So you can look at a drop-down box that will indicate whether or not you're choosing land food, seafood, food additives, dietary supplements, infant formula, medical foods, other foods for special dietary needs. In other words, all the different choices are listed in the drop-down box. And so you can access the system rather easily, and it's a great and easy format to walk through. But in order to request your certificate, you have to make sure that the facility that manufactures the product has been listed in this particular program, that they're certified within the Food Facility Registration Module. And if not, then you would have to take the time to make sure your particular manufacturing facility has been listed. When you go through that process, you'll have to provide information on the actual food manufacturer, such as their name and address, of course, and their contact key person, first and last name, and their email address. And then part of the additional information will be entering the information on your company as the exporter of record. So if you are selling this product domestically to someone else who's exporting, then the final exporter of record should be the one completing this information. So again, depending on your Incoterm or depending on how you structured your sale, make sure you are truly the exporter of record and not selling this domestically to another firm who's actually completing the export transaction. So the exporting company information, of course, includes the name of the exporter, their name, address, all their contact detailed information, as well as an email address capability. And then through this system, you'll actually describe your product, and you'll give detailed information. For example, does your product have a specific name, such as potato chips? And then is there a common name that might differ from that? You'll confirm the actual manufacturer. Those of you who might be exporting seafood might have to give a scientific name. And then any other comments about the actual transaction, the weight unit. And And then you can add an additional product. So if you're exporting more than one product, you're not limited in this transaction. Through their electronic system, you can make additions to the product line and then confirm everything through to the final destination. So they will look for your intended destination of shipment, the actual final country. So if your shipment is stopping, it's being transshipped from one country into another, you have to really make sure that you know the end destination and you've confirmed that in writing. And that's why we mentioned export compliance at the beginning of this program, because confirming who the end user is, of course, is one of the key elements of general export compliance, and certainly required when you're applying for a certificate of free sale. And one of the key benefits that you have within this electronic system is the ability to determine how many original certificates you would like to have made available. So again, at the time of the quote, it's really important, depending on the receiving country, to confirm how many original certificates that customer is seeking. So once you make this application, and if you confirm only one, then you find out through the process that you need 3 or 5 or some other number, it makes it a little bit more difficult. If you're doing this electronically, you are allowed to go in and somewhat modify an existing application that's not yet complete. If you're doing this hard copy and you've only asked for one, then you have to go through the process again. So you want to be careful to confirm this information. And in the electronic system, you can designate where these original certificates are sent. For example, you could send one directly to the manufacturer or distributor, or you could send one to another designated party with a copy back to yourself, and then, of course, to the importer of record or the buyer. While you're in this system, you'll also be able to choose how it will be sent. So you can indicate regular mail, or you can indicate a courier company. And if you choose for a courier company, then they'll ask you your actual account number so that they can assign that against your particular company. And then if there's any fees, depending on the number of certificates you requested, those will be automatically calculated in the system, and you'll have to make a final payment through that process. That certificate application process may also require you to attach potentially labels for each product of the certificate type that you selected. So again, you can initiate an application. You can save your information. If you get into this electronic system and you find that it's asking you for more information than you have prepared at the time you initiated it, you can save the information and go back in, modify it, confirm it, and take it through to completion. So it's probably best that you consider assigning this process to a couple of key people within your organization who over time will become familiar with it, such that they will know the information to gather before they enter the system. And of course, a certificate cannot be issued until all information is complete. So again, working with our salespeople through to the manufacturing team, you need to allocate anywhere, depending on the product and how busy the FDA is, you could allocate up to 15 days potentially at a minimal level to receive your certificate, and then they sometimes take as long as 8 weeks depending on any other issue with your product or your information or even the end user. So the electronic capability is fantastic, but there is a delay in the process, and so that should be estimated as part of your lead time for shipping. So when will the FDA potentially refuse to issue a certificate? Well, they will withhold an actual certificate from being issued for any product that does not meet the applicable requirements of the FDA Act. And of course, a certificate will not be issued if the FDA has already initiated an enforcement action. For example, a seizure or an injunction against your company. And other issues that may cause the FDA to refuse to issue a particular certificate may include the failure of the manufacturing facility to operate in compliance with good manufacturing practices. It may refuse if the manufacturing facility is not registered or listed with the FDA, or if that same facility has no inspectional information. So there could be a number of different things that cause the FDA to withhold the creation of the certificate. And again, it behooves the company to assign this process to a couple of key people who will know how to use the system, gather the information required, and then also have a good relationship with the FDA such that they can call and work through the process to avoid any particular holds. Now, other requirements. You do not have to go through this particular electronic system, as we've mentioned. Some companies choose to go through the different agencies, Department of State Health Services. Some companies are going to Chambers of Commerce or World Trade Organizations or other groups who are authorized to produce these documents. And in those cases, since these are being issued hard copy, they have the right to ask certain information from you. So they may ask you, for example, proof of your product being manufactured in the United States. So they're looking for a very specific statement on your letterhead, which they'll provide to you upon request. They may also ask you for proof of sale to 2 different U.S. customers, and will specify in the last 12 months. Again, if we're looking to confirm that this product has been manufactured in the United States or is eligible for sale in the United States, then requesting this in writing may be part of the process when you use a different agency who's working through this in a hard copy format. In terms of regulatory guidance, it's always best when possible to contact the various associations or agencies or work very closely with your freight forwarder and or your customer's customs broker, who will be very familiar with the customs clearance process in the receiving country, and verify the documentation that's going to be required to clear customs in that country. So some of your key goals are to put this information in writing and have an agreement to it through the quoting process and prior to exportation. And this is especially important if you're unsure about when to secure these documents, or you don't get appropriate information from the importer of record. Because if there's a delay at the border on the receiving side due to a lack of documentation, then there's going to be a discussion about who will pay the storage fees. Or if for some reason, and hopefully this doesn't happen, the product is confiscated by the receiving government, what work will need to be done to get it released, or whether or not they'll choose to go ahead and destroy it. So there should be agreements up front as to how this information is going to be secured and what actual documents are needed. You can also look at the United States. You can contact the FDA, certainly contact the Department of Commerce. We have many specialists on site who can help walk you through this process. And any other group that's familiar with your particular product line. And as a reminder, good importing, of course, from our customer's perspective, begins with good exporting. So the strategy then is to confirm all of these requirements in advance of the actual shipment, which means that if your first line of defense is the sales team, then the sales team should be part of the process who's involved in training, even if only a 30-minute session, on some of these different requirements. And they should be given a list of questions to supply to the end customer once the quote has been agreed to. And this will help alleviate some of the different issues that come up in the process. All right, Rosa, I'll refer this back to you.
Yes, thank you, Susan, very much for this thorough and very helpful presentation. I, for one, found it very helpful to understand the process of going through obtaining certificate of free sale, because this is a question that we here at Commerce Department get a lot of times from companies. When do I have to obtain one? What do I do with this particular certificate? When is it required? And just to add, Susan, a lot of questions that we're getting from companies and companies that I know they are on the line. They are in the business of different products, exporting different products, cosmetics, nutraceuticals, cosmeceuticals, food, pharmaceutical products. Some of them would be produced by the companies themselves. Others, they may be intermediaries. So I think going through that process really allowed us to figure out whose responsibility should be at what point. And just wanted to add that we at Department of Commerce stand ready to work with colleagues like Susan. We always communicate with each other, with our colleagues in the field, export assistance centers, as well as our partner agencies such as FDA, NOAA, APHIS at USDA, and others who might be in charge of issuing appropriate certificates. So again, as Susan mentioned at the beginning, we are open, both her as well as us, to take your questions and help you with individual particular situations that you may encounter in the process of exporting. And Susan, actually in the meantime, I noticed we got a couple of questions here. Let me see if I can read this. Here one of the participants is asking, we have a customer in Chile that is requiring a certificate of free sale for their private label cosmetic line, but we do not make their cosmetic line in the U.S. How do we go about getting mandatory documentation in that particular instance? Do you have any thoughts on that?
But generally, the FDA is not going to be involved in the certification of product that is not made in the United States. And so if this is a direct export offshore to offshore, let's say, for example, China to Chile, or I'm not sure what their countries are, but if it's offshore to offshore, then, and the sale is simply being conducted via the United States, but it never physically touches the United States, and it's not going to be shipped here and changed in any capacity, then the actual manufacturer or distributor of the cosmetics has to make sure that they, from that end country, from China, for example, in this case, directly to Chile, Chile would have to provide those requirements and what they're looking for specifically. And again, this goes back to that earlier slide when we talk about when you are the exporter of record, you need to know two things: how to get it out of the country legally from the country you're exporting, in this case China, and how to get it legally into Chile. And so those two countries may have their own agreements and their own processes. I'm not familiar if China has an electronic capability for that same certificate of sale or not. but the FDA generally doesn't get involved in product made outside the United States.
Well, thank you very much for that. And if there are any questions related to China, we would have folks in our office and overseas that could help you with that too. And the next one, here in writing, you have spoken about food. Does the same apply to medical devices or medicines?
Well, the certificates of sale are definitely required for various types. So, for example, when we go into the system, you can pick the type of product that you had. So I mentioned earlier, when you go into this system, this FERL system, the electronic system of the FDA, you're going to go into the Center for Food Safety and Applied Nutrition, and that in that area of the certificate online capability, this system will issue multiple export certificates based on the firm's product type. So, for example, if there is a medical device and it's required under this system, there'll be a drop-down box that you can click on, and it'll take you to that commodity or product. And then it will take you through the correct screens for your specific product. Now, one thing that I would like to note is that when you're looking at these different product types, there may be different agencies involved. So, for example, when we're dealing with cosmetics, we're generally dealing with the FDA and the Center for Food Safety and Applied Nutrition. If I'm looking at dairy products, then that's under the USDA. If you're looking at seafood, then you're under agriculture and FDA, and you have to deal with the Seafood and National Marine Fisheries Services. So one of the key things that you want to do, medical devices on the import side do have specific documents that are required. So on the export side, and again, depending on the receiving country and their requirements, you'd want to verify that. But the electronic system does allow for a drop-down box so that you can go in and specify exactly what you have.
Well, thank you for that. And we have another one. The presentation mentioned that certificates of free sale cannot include information about specific product lot codes, but we have customers that request to have that information included on the certificate. Can you please elaborate on that? In addition, what is the difference between free sale and health certificate?
So the FDA is processing the certificates of sale against a particular product type. For example, infant formula. They aren't specifying a particular lot. So when you go into the application, and you go into the electronic system, there's a field for the actual description. And that field allows you to add, it's a little bit more open, meaning there's a lot more room to add detailed information. So in the description and the description comment section, if your customer requires that, you could actually enter the lot number. It's just that there isn't a specific field for lot numbers because the FDA isn't monitoring that. So there's still that capability of entering it through the description process.
And the next question was, what is the difference between free sale and a health certificate?
So the free sale certificate, as we mentioned, is particular to any product under sanitary and health requirements that can be legally marked and or distributed in the United States. So when you talk about an export health certificate, those, and I don't know what their product line is, but I'm guessing that they might be exporting animals. So if it's an animal certificate, a health certificate is generally the health of the particular. For example, the export of animals requires that the export health certificate be completed by an accredited veterinarian who confirms that that particular animal or herd meets their health status. They conduct their particular tests, and they record the test results for the individual animals being exported, such that you're not exporting an animal that is ill or has a virus or has some other issue with it. So the health certificate is specific generally to the animal. These are issued under APHIS. So it probably, that information for what, I'm guessing what this person needs, if it's a live animal export, would be separate from, and you would want to go to the APHIS website first before any information on any other website.
Well, thank you for that. And the operator would like to see if there are any questions that folks may want to ask online. Live.
Thank you. If you would like to ask a question, please press *1. Please unmute your phone and record your name clearly when prompted. Your name is required to introduce your question. To withdraw your request, you may press *2. It'll be one moment for our first question, please. We have a question from Chris Rins. Your line is open.
Hello. We were going to export a number of different nutritional supplements, and they will be from possibly a number of different manufacturers. So if we have 3 different supplements from one manufacturer, do we get one certificate for those 3, or is that going to be each supplement needs its own certificate?
So when you enter if you go through the automated system, you can enter the product, like product 1, and you can indicate the manufacturer, and that company, as we noted earlier, has to be registered, and if not, you'll have to supply that information. And then when you've finished with that process, you can click on that system and add a second product. Then you'd go
from
through the same
manufacturer even.
Then it would bring up, when you bring up the second product line, it would go through and ask the manufacturer. And then you would
great.
You should be able to put multiple products in the certificate. However, once you close it out, if you decide to go back and if you've completed it and you forgot one item, then unfortunately you'll have to go through the whole process again separately.
Okay.
So the key is to save the information along the way.
Good idea.
I'm not showing any further questions at this time.
Okay, let me see if we have any other here. To piggyback on the first question earlier on obtaining a certificate of free sale for products not produced in the USA, what if it does come to the U.S.? For example, product is produced in Germany, shipped and packed in the U.S., and then exported out of the country. Is it possible to get a certificate of free sale for that item?
So generally the certificate of sale is issued by the by the Food and Drug Administration under manufacturers that are registered, and it has to be demonstrated that it was capable of being marketed and labeled in the United States. So in other words, proof that it could be sold in the United States or marketed here or labeled here. If the product is coming from another country and all it does is touch the ground in the U.S. and it's simply repackaged, it probably doesn't meet the requirements of what the FDA would consider necessary in order for them to issue the certificate.
Okay, and another one, is there a generic free sale certificate for exporting sausages to Colombia if there are multiple distributors requesting products?
Say that one again.
Okay. Is there a generic free sale certificate for exporting sausages to Colombia if there are multiple distributors requesting products?
Okay, so a generic one so that they can be used repetitively. No. The purpose of the certificate of sale is to make it product specific with a designated end user. So you do need to pick the country that it's going to. And so you need to issue it by that country, that designated country, and then of course the designated end user.
And I think the next question, I think you already answered that in the context of previous one. Does the certificate of free sale from the FDA include any reference to a specific country?
Yes. So you must indicate the final end destination. So in the beginning of the presentation, we talked about the definition of an export and also confirmed the concept of a re-export. So if it's going to one group and then being exported to another group, you may have requirements first and foremost for export controls. But when you issue the certificate, you're indicating to your knowledge who the end user is. So it must include the company that you're selling it to and designate that particular country and that particular recipient.
Okay, thank you for that. And there's another one. You mentioned this FDA electronic filing in Wisconsin. Companies are supposed to contact the Department of Agriculture, Trade and Consumer Protection. They process the COF certificate of free sale request. If it is a non-agricultural item, then the Electronic Development Corporation is to fill the questions. Do other states process this certificate on their own, or should we all be sending companies to this national FDA website?
Well, when you're exporting a product, we talked a little bit about in the beginning, making sure that you export legally and that you help the receiving country import legally. So if there's a state-specific rule that supersedes or requires a compliance to another agency, then you need to make sure that you're in compliance with that particular agency. So, for example, there's a division of food safety that notarizes certificates of free sale within Wisconsin when they do food processing and export their products. So if there's something specific under that Department of Agriculture in Wisconsin, then you'd have to be in compliance with that.
And Susan, if I also may add something from our perspective, a little maybe different question, but we understand that several states might be able to issue certificates of free sales on state level, and I asked our colleagues at FDA whether in their experience that would be sufficient for companies to be able to export their products just with a state level certification. And so the answer that we got from FDA was that many times that would work. Not all states have this capability or interest. However, you probably would know better than anyone else here that in terms of compliance, not every country would approve or accept the state-level certificate, in which case they will have to still go back to FDA. So it kind of depends. There's no clear-cut answer on that. Do you have any comment perhaps on that one?
Well, I mentioned it earlier, and it's important to note that we indicated that the certificate of free sale can be issued by the FDA or any other authorized group. So, for example, in Los Angeles, you can go to a Chamber of Commerce, and I think that's true still for several other states. In those cases, when you go to a non-FDA authorized group, you should understand that they probably, the importer of record will probably require that document to be notarized. So whether it's Wisconsin, LA, or a state-specific agency, so you could go to the FDA electronic capability, and I guess to further answer that previous question, would we direct people to the FDA site first? I would say yes, simply because it's a federal agency, and it undoubtedly supersedes some of the state laws. But if you are the exporter of record in a particular state that has another agency requirement, you must confirm what that is and be in compliance with it. But you can go to the Chamber of Commerce in many states. You can go to, we mentioned earlier, some people go to the World Trade Organizations. They're located in most major cities around the country. They can also issue these, but they may have requirements in addition to those that were listed in the electronic system. So one thing I mentioned, for example, was if you go to the World Customs Organization, the World Trade Organization, excuse me, let's say in New York, they want to be able to prove that you've actually sold this product in the United States in the past 12 months. They will ask you for proof of sale. If you go to the FDA electronic system, that is not one of the requirements.
That's very helpful. And since you mentioned notarization, another question, I understand that for some countries, let's say in the Middle East, a number of documents might need not only be notarized but also legalized by the respective consulates or certified and legalized. Would certificates of free sale be subject to this process for some countries too?
That's a great question, because there are some documents, for example, that go to the Chamber of Commerce, they get notarized and authorized, but in some receiving countries, you must go to that receiving country's consulate, and they must still stamp off on those particular documents. So this is, again, where at the time of the quote, I would verify in writing what the receiving country's specific requests or regulatory issues are, and you get this in writing in the quote, and you agree to provide those particular documents. Therefore, any document that's outside the scope of the agreement for which the importer has forgotten to explain to you, you as the exporter, it gives you some leeway in not being held responsible for storage fees that may start to be acquired while that shipment's sitting there and you're trying to secure another document. So when we talked at the very beginning briefly, of course, with the time that we have, we talked very briefly about confirming this, training your salespeople on what questions to ask, verify this in writing, and making it part of the agreement, the sales agreement, such that you can alleviate missing documentation that causes a shipment to be held on the receiving side. So yes, I would not rule out the possibility that a receiving country, specifically the Middle East, often requires things to be stamped off at their consulate. I would not rule that out as being part of your process, and then for that, you might need to add an additional 2 weeks.
That's right, and yeah, there's National U.S. Arab Chamber of Commerce and some other chambers can be helpful in actually not only certifying documentation but forwarding it to the consulates. But like you say, you have to add additional time and, of course, expense for the planning purposes. And I just wanted to add too, we are past the hour. Wanted to thank everyone for tuning in today. And thank you, Susan, for this really wonderful presentation. And thank you for agreeing to answer follow-up questions, if any. And we also at the Trade Information Center stand ready to help you with any of the questions. We might have the answer, so if not, we'll find someone for you who would be able to help you out, be it our colleagues at the Department of Commerce, Export Assistance Centers throughout the country, our colleagues in our overseas offices, as well as our partner agencies and private sector partners. So thank you very much to all of you. We will be sharing today's presentation with you, and if you have any questions, the email that you have from us, you can ask us any question in email that you receive about dialing in today, or you can email us at tic@trade.gov. In addition, you can also find information about additional processes and procedures as far as exporting is concerned on our export.gov website. And on that website, you may also find information about the upcoming webinars that we put together for you, as well as we have on that website number of archived webinars that would walk you through different steps of exporting. So thank you all, and please contact or call us anytime you need us. Again, TIC@trade.gov and 1-800-USA-TRADE. And, of course, you have Susan's information. And, again, thank you, Susan, so much. Appreciate it.
All right. Thank you. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you for your participation on today's call. The call has concluded. You may disconnect at this time. Thank you.